This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. A White House panel has proposed a series of curbs on some key National Security Agency surveillance operations following the leaks by former NSA contractor Edward Snowden. The panel recommended the NSA halt its bulk collection of billions of American phone call records. The panel's report said, quote, "In our view, the current storage by the government of bulk metadata creates potential risks to public trust, personal privacy, and civil liberties." The panel also said the mass collection of the phone records, quotes, was not essential to preventing any terrorist attack. But the panel did not call for an end to the collection of the phone records. Instead, it said those records should be held by telecommunications providers or a private third party.
The report was released just 2 days after a federal judge ruled the bulk collection of telephone data by the government was almost Orwellian. The NSA review panel also criticized the agency's attacks on encryption and use of computer programming flaws to mount cyber attacks. On Wednesday, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney said some of the outside panel's recommendations could be accepted, others studied further, and some rejected.
Over the next several weeks, we will be reviewing the review group's report and its 46 recommendations as we consider the path forward, including sorting through which recommendations we will implement, which might require further study, and which we will choose not to pursue. It's a substantive, lengthy report, and it merits serious review and assessment. When we finish the internal review, the overall internal review in January, the President will deliver remarks to outline the outcomes of our work.
We're joined now by two guests. Kirk Wiebe worked at the National Security Agency for more than 32 years. He received the NSA's second highest award, the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. Also with us is Ben Weisner, Edward Snowden's legal advisor and director of the ACLU's Speech Privacy and Technology Project. Ben, let's begin with you. Your response to the panel's recommendations.
You know, my first thought yesterday was, I wonder if even Time magazine now realizes that they should have chosen Edward Snowden as the person of the year. What a week this has been to vindicate the act of conscience that he engaged in. First, a conservative federal judge saying that the NSA's sweeping domestic intelligence program violates the Constitution. Then what we expected to be a whitewash executive branch report coming back with these really incredible recommendations for a sweeping overhaul. None of this would have happened but for what Snowden did, and we shouldn't believe a word that the government says when they say that these programs would have been reviewed anyway in the ordinary course.
But in the report itself, in some of the recommendations, what's your initial reaction?
Well, look, I'll be candid. People in the civil liberties community were sharpening our knives. We were waiting for this to be a sort of cover-up, cosmetic reform. But in fact, you know, I saw an email this morning from a colleague saying that she was gobsmacked by how far this goes. Now, the question will be how much of it the White House recommends and how much of it Congress legislates. But huge changes on the NSA's technological surveillance, as Amy said in the lead-in, limits on their undermining of encryption, on using backdoors, and an end to one of the most dangerous programs, which is the NSA sitting on a database of every single one of Americans' phone calls. If these reforms are passed, they'll be the most sweeping reforms in 4 decades.
But this is an advisory panel to President Obama. So what does it mean to say if they are passed?
Well, look, it plants a flag. This isn't just an advisory panel. This is comprised of a high-level former CIA official, of a high-level counterterrorism official, and some of Obama's closest friends. So the fact that this is where the debate begins in the administration is extremely significant.
You spoke to Edward Snowden yesterday. What was his response?
You know, we were not in contact after the report came out, but I will say that he has been so gratified by the decision by the judge a couple of days ago. That was his main hope. You know, he had watched over the last decade as challenges to surveillance programs brought by the ACLU and others were thrown out by courts, not because the court said the programs were legal, but because the court said that we had no right to be there, because we couldn't demonstrate that our plaintiffs were victims of these surveillance practices, and therefore we didn't have standing. That all changed when when Edward Snowden gave Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras an order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that demonstrated that the ACLU and everyone else has their phone records swept up every day by the NSA. So he was hoping that precisely this kind of thing would happen, that it would be debated by a real and open court.
We're also joined by Kirk Wiebe, who worked at the NSA for 32 years. Your reaction both to the federal court decision earlier this week and now to the recommendations of the panel?
Hi, good morning. My reaction is one of caution. I'm optimistic, but remember, this is a self-serving executive report, and although it does recommend significant steps, whatever happens, we have to put teeth into the mouth of oversight. You know, we've been operating for years and years on a wink, a nod, and a handshake, and assurances that nothing's wrong. And we keep getting to the wrong. NSA's been caught now, what, 3 or 4 times historically, spying on Americans. Does anyone really believe it's not going to happen again because of the reports, the recommendations of this panel? No. We need to have substantive oversight by both Congress and the courts. And when I say substantive, I don't mean a handshake. I'm talking about wires, computer access to these sensitive databases, audit procedures that account for every data access by an analyst, or anyone for that matter, whether it be a Snowden or anyone else. There needs to be an audit process that has high integrity, that is comprehensive, and that people at Congress and or the judiciary, whether it be FISA or some other court, there needs to be a small group of people, technologically astute, with clearances, but they work for an opposing branch of government. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves back here again in about 10 years.
The NSA review group was critical of the administration's defense that the agency's data-gathering efforts have helped thwart terrorist attacks. It wrote, quote, "Our review suggests the information contributed to terrorist investigations by the use of Section 215 telephony metadata was not essential to preventing attacks and could readily have been obtained in a timely manner using conventional Section 215 orders. Moreover, there's reason for caution about the view that the program is efficacious in alleviating concern about possible terrorist connections, given the fact that the metadata captured by the program covers only a portion of the records of only a few telephone service providers." Ben Weisner, translate that into English. Explain Section 215 and what this means.
Well, Section 215 was always a controversial section of the Patriot Act. It was what we used to refer to as the library records provision, because it allowed the government, basically just on a relevant standard, meaning almost anything, to get any records from third parties. But having said that, none of our worst fears about this even approached what the government was actually doing. The government was using Section 215 of the Patriot Act to require every telephone company in the United States on a daily basis to turn over every record of every phone call. So essentially, they were sitting on this enormous map of every American's communications, and they were doing this with one order a year from the FISA court, just one order saying that this would be relevant. And their argument for relevance was, well, someone's going to do something wrong at some point, and we need to have the whole database to search it. In other words, we need to have a whole haystack because one day someone's going to drop a needle into it. And it really turns the Fourth Amendment upside down. The law should require the government to have suspicion first and search second. This essentially said, we'll collect it all first, and maybe we'll need it later. It was a justification for more than just this. It would be a justification for flying a drone over every city at all times, or for putting cameras even in our own home. So what this panel says is, number one, there's no evidence that this was useful for stopping terrorist attacks and that you couldn't have done it in a more narrow way. And number two, there is a danger in having the government sit on this pile of information because if there is a terrorist attack in the future, if there is a war in the future, the rules that prevent the government from going into that and using it for any purpose could easily be swept aside.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guest is Ben Weisner. He is the legal advisor to Edward Snowden, who remains in Russia, where he's been granted temporary asylum for 1 year. We want to ask about his letter to Brazil Brazil, asking for permanent asylum there. And we're also joined by Kirk Wiebe, who worked at the NSA for 32 years, and want to hear his own story of being a whistleblower. What are the protections for intelligence whistleblowers? Do they have any? This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We'll be back in a minute. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily, independent, global, grassroots news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org today. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.